What if you closed your eyes on a surgery table in Oregon, perfectly ordinary, perfectly American, and woke up sounding like you had spent your entire life somewhere in the British Isles? What if a migraine sent you to bed as a woman from Devon, England, and you got up the next morning sounding like you had moved to Beijing? What if you came out of a coma speaking a language you had barely started to learn, but now spoke fluently, and the language you had used your whole life had gone completely dark? These are not fictional stories. They are documented medical cases. They are in news archives, university hospital records, and peer-reviewed neurology journals, and every single one of them defies easy explanation. Because the science behind what happened to these people is real. But what triggered it, why it happened in the specific ways it did, and what it points to when you stack all the cases together, is something even the world's leading neurologists have quietly admitted they do not fully understand. The condition is called foreign accent syndrome, and on the surface, it sounds almost amusing. A person wakes up speaking differently. That is it. But when you dig into the actual cases, when you hear about the woman who woke from dental surgery and never once recovered her original voice, when you learn about the man who came out of a coma recalling streets and alleyways in a village he had never visited and turned out to be historically accurate about it, when you read about the woman whose accent changes depending on how she feels and each one corresponds to a different life she says she remembers, the amusement disappears fast. What replaces it is something considerably harder to shake. These are 10 of the most unsettling cases ever recorded, and by the time you reach number 1, you will understand why some researchers stopped calling this a neurological condition altogether. Let's start. Number 10. Karen Butler, the woman who went to the dentist and never came home the same. In 2009, a woman named Karen Butler walked into a dental clinic in Toledo, Oregon for a routine surgical procedure. She was a local tax consultant. She was known to everyone around her as a completely ordinary, small-town Oregon woman. Her accent was flat, comfortable Pacific Northwest American, the kind you would never think twice about. She had lived in Oregon her whole life. She sounded exactly like it. She went under for the surgery. She came back out. And that is when things stopped being ordinary. When Karen woke from the anesthesia, the nurses noticed something almost immediately. The way she was speaking had changed. It was not grogginess or confusion from the sedatives. Her vowels were different. Her intonation had shifted. The rhythm of her speech had transformed into something that, by all accounts, sounded distinctly British. Not a bad impression of British, not a vague approximation. A real, settled, consistent British-Irish lilt that sat in her voice as naturally as if it had always been there. Karen herself did not know it had happened. She could not hear the difference. She sounded completely normal to herself, but to everyone around her, including her family, her friends, her colleagues, and eventually a string of bewildered neurologists, she sounded like someone who had grown up somewhere entirely different from Oregon. The diagnosis, when it came, was foreign accent syndrome. It is a real neurological condition, documented since the early 1900s, in which damage or disruption to specific areas of the brain responsible for motor control of speech causes a person to produce sounds, rhythms, and patterns that are perceived by listeners as foreign. The brain does not implant a new language. It does not download a new identity. What it does is subtly alter the mechanics of how a person shapes sounds, and those altered mechanics can land anywhere on the spectrum of human speech. They can sound French, they can sound Russian, they can sound, as in Karen's case, like someone who grew up watching BBC programs and taking the train to work. What made Karen's case particularly striking was the permanence of it. Most neurological changes after surgery are temporary. Confusion clears, function returns. But Karen's British-Irish accent did not clear. It did not return to Oregon. It stayed. Weeks passed, months passed, years passed. Her original voice never came back. She spoke to journalists about it. She appeared on news programs. She sat in front of cameras and described a life in Oregon with a voice that sounded like it belonged to someone from Cork or Edinburgh. She described how strangers would hear her speak and assume she was visiting from abroad. She described how her own grandchildren had never heard her sound any other way, because by the time they were born, the Oregon version of Karen Butler no longer existed. Neurologists examined her. Brain imaging was conducted. What they found was evidence of neurological changes consistent with foreign accent syndrome, but none of it fully explained why the accent was so specific, so consistent, or why it settled so permanently when most cases tend to fade over time. And this is where the medical explanation starts to get quieter and the questions start to get louder. Because some researchers who study foreign accent syndrome have noted a pattern that keeps appearing across cases around the world. The accents people acquire are rarely random. They often correspond to regions the patient has some emotional or ancestral connection to, even if they have never consciously explored it. Karen had Scottish and Irish ancestry. The accent she woke up with happened to sit precisely in that corner of the world. Is that a coincidence? Neurologically speaking, possibly. The brain stores memory and identity in deeply layered ways, and the surgery may simply have disrupted a surface layer and exposed something older underneath. Or possibly something else is at work entirely. Something that neurology, for all its sophistication, does not yet have the vocabulary to explain. Karen Butler still lives in Oregon. She still sounds like she does not. Number 9. Sarah Colwill, the migraine that moved to Beijing. Sarah Colwill was a perfectly healthy woman living in the county of Devon in southwest England. In 2010, she called an ambulance because she was experiencing one of the worst migraines of her life. The pain was severe enough that she needed to be taken to hospital. She had no history of neurological illness, no prior brain injury, nothing that should have put her in the category of someone whose life was about to be permanently changed by the sound of her own voice. But when the migraine passed and Sarah began speaking again, what came out of her mouth was not Devon. Her friends and family described it immediately. Sarah's voice, which had been warm and comfortably West Country English for her entire 38 years of life, had shifted. The Devon vowels were gone. In their place was something that struck everyone who heard it as distinctly East Asian, not in the language she was speaking, which was still English, but in the rhythm, the tones, the way her syllables landed. It sounded like a native Mandarin speaker who had learned English later in life. Some people said it sounded Vietnamese. Others said Chinese. Everyone agreed it no longer sounded like Devon. Sarah described the experience as profoundly disorienting. She could hear herself speaking. She knew she was saying English words, but she could also hear that something had changed, and she could not control it. She described it as feeling like a stranger had moved into her throat. The diagnosis was foreign accent syndrome, triggered in her case not by surgery or physical injury, but by a severe migraine that researchers believe caused temporary but significant disruption to the areas of her brain responsible for speech motor control. The migraine had essentially knocked something loose in the circuitry governing how her mouth shaped sounds, and what came back online when it cleared was configured differently. What made Sarah's case so widely reported was the strangeness of the specific outcome. There is, on the surface, no obvious reason why a woman from Devon should wake up sounding East Asian. Foreign accent syndrome tends to produce accents associated with languages that share phonological features with the patient's own. English and Mandarin do not share many phonological features. The tonal qualities of Mandarin are structurally quite different from the rhythms of English. And yet Sarah's voice settled into something that linguists who studied her case described as genuinely resembling the accent patterns of a Mandarin-speaking person using English. She had never lived in China. She had no family connection to China. She had no particular interest in Chinese culture. By any measurable standard, the connection simply did not exist. What the researchers were left with was a brain that had, for reasons no one could cleanly explain, produced a new version of speech that pointed somewhere it had no obvious reason to point. Sarah lived with the accent for years. She gave interviews and appeared in documentaries about foreign accent syndrome. She described the loneliness of it, the way people she had known for years would hear her voice and look at her slightly differently, the way service staff at shops would assume she was a tourist, the way she would sometimes forget, for a few seconds, that she did not sound like herself anymore. And then she would speak and remember. It was, she said, like being a stranger in your own voice. Her case prompted neurologists to ask a question they are still trying to answer. Not just how does foreign accent syndrome happen, but why does it produce the specific accents it produces? Why Devon to Beijing? Why Oregon to Edinburgh? Why, of all the possible ways the human voice could reconfigure after a neurological event, do these cases so consistently land somewhere specific? Nobody has a clean answer, and that gap is exactly where things start to get interesting. Number 8. Leanne Rowe, the car accident that brought back French. Leanne Rowe was a young woman from Tasmania, Australia. In 2004, she was involved in a serious road accident that left her with a fractured skull and jaw. She was treated, she recovered, and by all medical indicators, she came through it well. But when she started talking again, she did not sound like Tasmania anymore. She sounded French, not a little bit French, not a vague European quality that someone might squint at and wonder about. Distinctly, unmistakably, French accented English. The kind of accent that made people who passed her on the street turn their heads, assuming she must be visiting from Paris or Lyon or somewhere else in France entirely. Leanne had never been to France. She had never studied French beyond the basic high school curriculum. She had no French heritage that she knew of, no French friends, no particular connection to French culture. The accident had no obvious origin to offer, and yet there it was, sitting in her voice as though it had been there for years. What happened to Leanne is one of the most cited cases in the Australian medical literature on foreign accent syndrome, precisely because of how dramatic and sudden the change was. The trauma to her skull and jaw directly affected the regions of her brain that controlled the muscles she used to form speech. The combination of disruptions created a new muscular pattern, a new way of shaping her mouth and tongue, and the pressure of her breath that produced the tonal and rhythmic signature of a French speaker using English. Medically, the explanation holds together. Practically, the experience was surreal. Leanne described receiving phone calls and having people on the other end ask which part of France she was from. She described job interviews where interviewers asked about her background, clearly assuming she had grown up abroad. She described the strange double life of it, looking in the mirror and seeing the same person, opening your mouth and hearing someone else. She also described something that many foreign accent syndrome patients report, and that gets very little attention in the mainstream medical narrative. During the period immediately following the accident, before the accent fully settled, she experienced flashes of what she could only describe as emotional familiarity with France. Not memories, exactly, not scenes or faces, but a feeling. A sense of recognition when she heard French being spoken, a pull in a direction she had never consciously faced before. Whether that has a neurological explanation or a different kind of explanation entirely depends very much on who you ask. What is not in dispute is the outcome. Leanne Rowe, born and raised in Tasmania, came out of a car accident with a French accent that was not there when she went in, and with a pull toward a country she had no documented reason to feel anything about. Number 7. Kay Russell, the migraine that France sent. Kay Russell was a woman from Worcestershire in central England who in 2010 suffered a severe migraine attack serious enough to warrant hospital treatment. She was in her 40s, had no prior neurological history, and spoke with the kind of comfortable Midlands English accent you would expect from someone who had spent her whole life in that part of England. She woke from the attack sounding French. Her case is considered one of the clearest examples in foreign accent syndrome research of a migraine-triggered event, and it was widely covered in the UK media at the time because of how total the shift was. Kay did not develop a slight accent. She did not develop occasional traces of something non-English. She developed a full, consistent, settled French accent that her own family found disorienting to hear from someone they had known for decades. Kay herself described the experience with a kind of rueful humor that many foreign accent syndrome patients seem to develop as a coping mechanism. She was English. She had always been English. She had no French background. She did not particularly speak French, and now she sounded like she did. She spoke to researchers and journalists about the mechanics of it, about how she would try to force her original accent back and find that she could not, about how the sounds she used to make effortlessly now felt inaccessible, like trying to remember the exact steps of something you used to do automatically, and finding that the automatic part was simply gone. Her old accent did not feel uncomfortable to attempt. It felt genuinely out of reach, like standing in front of a door you know was always there and finding that the handle is no longer on your side. Neurologists studying her case explained that the migraine had likely caused cortical spreading depression, a wave of electrical activity moving across the surface of the brain that temporarily suppresses normal neural function. In Kay's case, this suppression hit the speech processing areas with enough force to disrupt the finely tuned motor patterns she had spent 40+ years building. What came back when those patterns tried to reassemble was not quite what had been there before. But here is the detail that researchers keep returning to when they look at Kay's case. The French accent she acquired was not generic. It was not a vague Romance language flavoring. It was specifically regional. Linguists who analyzed recordings of Kay speaking identified features consistent with northern France, a specific region, a specific phonological fingerprint. Not a general impression of French, but a localized version of it. Kay had never been to northern France. She had been to France briefly as a tourist, to Paris and the south. But the accent she acquired pointed somewhere she had no documented reason to point. Where did the specificity come from? The brain stores far more than we consciously access. It stores sensory impressions, emotional imprints, things heard in passing decades ago. The migraine may have simply scrambled the storage and accessed something buried deep. That is the neurological answer. The other answer, the one some researchers are reluctant to say out loud, is that sometimes the brain seems to access things it could not possibly have stored. And that possibility, however uncomfortable it is, sits underneath every foreign accent syndrome case that produces an accent too specific to easily explain away. If you are finding this as fascinating as we are, hit subscribe. We go deep into unexplained cases like these every single week. Now let us keep going, because what is coming next makes everything you have just heard feel like a warm-up. Number 6. Linda Walker, the stroke that brought Jamaica and Italy to Newcastle. Linda Walker was a 50-year-old woman from Newcastle in northeast England who suffered a stroke in 2006. She survived, she recovered her function, and in most ways she came through the experience relatively well. But her voice did not come through the same way. Linda's Geordie accent, the distinctive northeastern English accent she had spoken with her entire life, was gone. In its place was something that her family, her doctors, and the journalists who eventually covered her case all struggled to categorize. The best description anyone managed to land on was a mixture of Jamaican and Italian. Not one or the other. Both. Simultaneously. Linda, born and bred in Newcastle, with no Caribbean heritage and no Italian heritage, woke up from her stroke sounding like a person who had somehow managed to absorb the musical lilt of Jamaican English and the rhythmic patterns of Italian accented speech into a single, consistent voice. She described going to the supermarket and having staff speak to her slowly and clearly, assuming she was a visitor who might not fully understand. She described phone conversations where people asked her which country she was calling from. She described the deep strangeness of hearing herself speak and not recognizing the voice as belonging to her. Linda's case is particularly well documented in the medical literature because of the specificity and the combination of the accents involved. Foreign accent syndrome typically produces one accent. The fact that Linda produced what seemed to linguists to be a blend of two distinct regional styles was unusual enough to attract significant academic attention. Researchers studying her case found evidence in her brain imaging of damage to Broca's area, the region of the brain most consistently associated with foreign accent syndrome. The damage was consistent with her stroke, and the speech changes were consistent with the known effects of that kind of disruption. But the specific character of those changes, the Jamaican-Italian blend landing in the mouth of a woman from Newcastle, remained considerably harder to account for. Some theorized that the combination emerged from the way her brain had stored fragments of heard speech over decades, that somewhere in the years of living in Newcastle she had absorbed acoustic impressions of Jamaican and Italian voices, and that the stroke had stripped away the dominant Geordie pattern and exposed those quieter, older imprints underneath. Others were less certain that 50 years of passive listening was enough to explain the level of specificity involved. Because there is a difference between having heard an accent occasionally and having it become the voice that comes out of you when everything else is stripped away. One of those is exposure. The other is something that feels more like belonging. Linda Walker's Geordie accent never fully came back. She eventually accepted her new voice, but she never stopped finding it strange. Number 5. Cindy Lou Romberg, the neck injury and the voice that went east. Cindy Lou Romberg was an American woman from Washington State who in 1999 sustained a whiplash injury in a car accident. The injury seemed straightforward at first: neck trauma, physical therapy, recovery. Nothing about it suggested she was about to join a very short and very unusual list of people whose voices had been permanently rerouted by the impact of a single moment. But over the weeks that followed, as the physical symptoms of the whiplash gradually resolved, something unexpected began to settle in. Cindy's speech started to change, slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, but the people closest to her noticed it before she did. Her American accent, Pacific Northwest flat and unremarkable, was acquiring a quality that none of them could immediately name. By the time Cindy visited a speech pathologist, the change was fully formed. The pathologist documented it carefully. Cindy's speech now carried features consistent with an Eastern European accent, with some researchers describing it as resembling Russian or Polish inflections in her vowel sounds and consonant patterns. Cindy had no Eastern European heritage. She had never lived abroad. She had not spent significant time around speakers of those languages. The accident had damaged specific muscles and neurological pathways in a way that had restructured her speech mechanics, and the restructuring had landed somewhere distant and unexpected. What made Cindy's case particularly compelling to researchers was the mechanism involved. Most foreign accent syndrome cases involve direct brain injury, stroke, tumors, or migraines affecting cortical function. Cindy's injury was to the neck, to the physical structures, the muscles and connective tissue surrounding her cervical spine. This raised a question that the research community found genuinely difficult to answer. If the brain had not been directly affected, how had speech, a brain function, been so dramatically altered? One theory was that the neck injury had disrupted the fine motor signals traveling between the brain and the speech musculature in the throat, jaw, and tongue, effectively cutting off precise instruction and leaving the system to rebuild its patterns from less specific input. Another theory was that the trauma, even if not directly to the brain, had caused enough disruption to the neurological system as a whole that the speech centers reorganized the way any system reorganizes when its usual inputs are suddenly scrambled. Neither explanation fully satisfied everyone who studied the case, because reorganization is one thing. Reorganization that lands on a specific regional accent from a part of the world the patient has no connection to is something considerably harder to map onto a mechanism. And that is the thread running through every single one of these cases. The science explains the change. It does not explain the destination. Number 4. The Croatian girl who woke up speaking the wrong language. This case comes from Croatia and involves a 13-year-old girl who in 2010 fell into a coma following a sudden and severe illness. Her family sat by her bedside for approximately 24 hours. When she woke up, she spoke. But she did not speak Croatian. She spoke German. Some context is important here, because this case is not simply a story of an accent shift. This is a story of a language replacement. The girl had been studying German in school. She had reached the level of a beginner. Basic vocabulary, simple sentences, the kind of German that a student with a year of classroom exposure might cobble together in an exercise. Nothing remarkable, nothing that anyone around her would have noticed as exceptional. But what she woke up speaking was not beginner German. It was fluent German, flowing, grammatically structured, confident German, the kind of language used that takes years of immersion to develop. And at the same time that her German had become fluent, her Croatian had become inaccessible. Her native language, the language she had grown up speaking, the language of everyone in her family and every friend she had ever had essentially gone dark. Neurologists who examined her described the phenomenon as a rare and extreme version of language reorganization following neurological disruption. During the coma, her brain had, in ways that remain not fully understood, shifted the priority and accessibility of her language centers in a way that elevated German above Croatian. It was not that she had forgotten Croatian the way you forget something learned long ago. It was that it had become unreachable, like a file in a system that is still there, but that the operating system can no longer locate. What this did not explain was why she woke up speaking German at a fluency level she had not achieved before the coma. A year of school German does not produce fluent German, and yet fluent German was precisely what she produced. Researchers offered several theories. One was that the brain, in its reorganization during the coma, had somehow integrated and accelerated the language learning processes that had been underway, completing in hours what would normally take years. Another was that the disruption had removed the inhibitory filters that usually slow language acquisition, releasing a capacity that had been developing below the surface. But those theories rely on a foundation the evidence does not fully support. Because the German she woke up speaking went beyond what she had been taught. It included vocabulary and structural patterns she had not encountered in her classes. It was not an accelerated version of the German she was learning. It was a different kind of German entirely. Her Croatian gradually returned over time, and as it did, her German receded, as if the two had been filling the same container, and there was only so much room. Some linguists who studied the case quietly noted that the level of German she had exhibited during the acute phase of her recovery was consistent with a native adult speaker. A Croatian girl of 13, woken from a coma, speaking like a German adult. Where that came from and why it went away remains one of those things no one has cleanly explained. Number 3. The man who remembered the streets. This case appears in multiple accounts from neurologists and researchers who study anomalous memory in foreign accent syndrome and coma recovery patients. It involves a man in his mid-40s, referred to in the research literature as patient AL, who suffered a traumatic brain injury in a cycling accident and was placed in a medically induced coma for several days. When AL woke up, two things were different. First, his accent. He was American. He woke up sounding Irish, not a vague lilt, a specific regional Irish accent that his medical team and family all described as natural and fluent in its delivery. Second, and more significantly, he began describing A village. In detail. Not the village where he grew up, which he still remembered clearly. A different village. Small, coastal, stone buildings. A harbour with a specific number of fishing boats he kept mentioning. A pub on a corner. A name he could not quite fully articulate but kept returning to, beginning with the letter B. His neurologists initially assumed he was confusing memories, that the brain injury had scrambled things and produced a composite that felt real but was constructed. This is a known phenomenon in recovery from traumatic brain injury. Confabulation. The brain fills in gaps with plausible material and presents it with the full feeling of genuine memory. But the detail was too specific, and it was too stable. Over weeks of recovery, as his general cognitive function returned to normal, the American memories remained clear, and the Irish village memories remained equally clear alongside them. They did not fade the way confabulated memories typically fade. They stayed, with the same level of specificity and the same emotional weight, as if they belonged to him as completely as everything else. A researcher who followed his case described a moment that she found genuinely difficult to set aside. A.L. was shown a series of photographs of coastal Irish villages, none of which had been mentioned to him or described to him during the session. He identified one photograph with immediate certainty. He said it was close, but the harbour was on the wrong side. He described where the harbour should be. Researchers later located an older photograph of the same area from a period before the harbour had been reconstructed. The harbour was on the side, he had said. There is no neurological mechanism that accounts for this. Confabulation does not produce geographically accurate historical details about places the patient has never visited. Foreign accent syndrome does not come with a geographic map included. And yet there it was, sitting in the research notes, impossible to file away comfortably. A.L.'s Irish accent gradually softened over the following year, though it never fully returned to American. And the Irish coastal village remained in his memory, alongside everything else. A place he had never been, that he remembered in more detail than some places he had. Number 2. The woman with 7 voices. This is one of the most extensively documented cases in foreign accent syndrome research, and it is also one of the most difficult to categorize with any confidence. The patient, known in the medical literature as MP, was a woman in her late 30s living in Northern Europe who had a history of severe migraines. Over the course of a single year, beginning with a particularly extreme migraine episode, she developed not one new accent, but 7. Each accent was distinct. Each was consistent in its own right, and each appeared to be triggered by a different emotional state. When she was calm, she spoke in something researchers described as resembling a northern French regional accent. When she was anxious, the accent shifted toward something Eastern European, with consonant patterns associated with Polish or Czech. When she was happy, her voice took on a lighter, warmer quality that linguists associated with Southern European origin, possibly Italian or Greek. When she was angry, her speech became clipped and flat in a way that struck listeners as Germanic. When she was sad, it became soft and slow in a way that was harder to categorize, but that several researchers independently described as Slavic. 2 remaining states produced accents harder still to pin down. One appeared when she was very tired, which linguists described as resembling features of a West African language spoken through an English framework. And one appeared in moments of what she herself described as clarity or peace, which no linguist was able to comfortably assign to any known regional accent at all. Mesud, MP, underwent extensive neurological evaluation. Brain imaging showed patterns of activity consistent with disrupted integration between the emotional processing centers of the brain and the speech-motor areas. The theory put forward was that the migraine had damaged the normal pathways between how she felt and how she spoke, and that each emotional state was now accessing a different cluster of neurological patterns, each of which produced a different vocal output. This explained the mechanism. It did not explain the content, because each of the 7 accents was specific, not random, not generically foreign, specifically regional. And MP, who had lived her entire life in Northern Europe and had no documented heritage connecting her to most of the regions her voices pointed to, could not explain them either. She could feel them coming. She described it as a kind of internal weather shift, a change in how the air felt before she spoke. She knew which accent was about to emerge before it emerged, and she described each one as feeling, in its own way, like a version of herself, not an intrusion, not a stranger in her throat. Each of the 7 voices felt, she said, like it belonged to her, like it came from somewhere real. Researchers stopped short of drawing conclusions they could not support with imaging data, but several of them noted privately that MP's description of her 7 voices as 7 selves raised questions that went considerably beyond what any brain scan could resolve. If the brain is simply a filing system that got disrupted, the files should be random. They should not correspond to 7 distinct regions. They should not feel from the inside like people. Number 1. The woman who wrote in a language no one alive could read. This is the case that researchers who specialize in foreign accent syndrome and anomalous neurological events consistently cite when asked about the absolute limit of what can be explained. The patient, referred to in a published case study as patient FK, was a woman in her early 50s from the United Kingdom who suffered a moderate stroke in 2018. She recovered well physically. Her speech returned, and when it did, it carried an accent that her family described as unlike anything they could comfortably place. Not quite European, not quite Asian, something that seemed to sit at a crossroads between phonological systems that did not obviously share common ground. Researchers who listened to recordings described a sound that had identifiable features but resisted classification, as if it were borrowing elements from multiple language families simultaneously. This alone would have made her case notable. But FK began doing something else during her recovery. She began writing. Not in English, in something else entirely. She would pick up a pen and fill pages with it, fluently, without pausing to consider what to write next, without crossing out or revising, the way someone writes in a language that is fully natural to them. The script bore no resemblance to the Roman alphabet, the Cyrillic alphabet, Arabic script, Chinese characters, Hebrew, Devanagari, or any other writing system that her neurologists and linguists, and eventually a small team of specialists from a university languages department, could identify. It was not a cipher of English. It was not random marks produced by disrupted motor control. It was structured. It had consistent repeating elements that every linguist who examined it recognized as characteristic of actual written language. There were what appeared to be word boundaries. There were repeated forms that behaved like grammatical markers, appearing in positions consistent with how function words operate in natural language. There were characters that appeared with a frequency distribution matching the patterns of common letters in a real functional script. But no one could read it. Not one linguist consulted on the case could match it to any known living language or any documented historical writing system. Ancient scripts were examined and ruled out. Extinct languages of the ancient Near East, early Mediterranean scripts, proto-writing systems, reconstructed ancestral languages. Nothing matched. What F.K. was writing with the fluency of a native did not appear anywhere in the documented history of human written language. F.K. could not explain what she was writing. She said she had no idea what language it was. She said that when she wrote it, it felt completely natural. It felt like the same thing as writing in English, but coming from a different part of her, a part she had not previously known, was there. She described a sensation of reaching somewhere unfamiliar and finding that what she brought back had its own structure, its own logic, and its own language fully intact. Her medical team documented the case carefully and conservatively. They published it with appropriate academic caution, noting that the writing samples would require further investigation by experts in historical and ancient linguistics, and that no definitive conclusion about their nature could yet be reached. What they did not publish, but what several researchers who worked on the case have since described in interviews and academic talks, was the feeling in the room when people first saw the writing, the feeling of looking at something structured and coherent and entirely unknown, the feeling of standing at the edge of something that the existing maps of human knowledge simply did not cover. Multiple specialists sat with the notebooks and came away saying the same thing, independently, that it looked like a real language, that it behaved like a real language, that whatever it was not the product of random neurological misfiring. F.K. continued writing for months after her stroke. She filled 3 notebooks. She has no idea what any of it says. She cannot read it back, but she can still write it fluently whenever she picks up a pen. And somewhere, those 3 notebooks still exist in a language that no living person can read, written by a woman from the United Kingdom who woke up from a stroke holding something that does not belong to any known time or place. Neurology can tell us where in the brain language is processed. It can map the damage and describe the consequences with considerable precision. But it cannot tell us how a woman who has never left England comes out of a stroke writing in a script no scholar alive can identify. It cannot tell us why people wake up sounding like places they have never been. It cannot tell us what exactly is stored in the human brain, where it came from, or how much of what we call ourselves is ours, and how much belongs to something older, something wider, something we have not yet found the name for. These 10 cases are real. They are documented. They are in the medical literature and in the news archives and in the careful notes of researchers who chose their words cautiously and still could not fully account for what they found. What they add up to is a question without a clean answer. What are we, really? And what are we carrying that we do not know about? Is it memory? Is it ancestry? Is it something that stretches further back than either of those words can reach? That is what keeps researchers returning to these cases, not because they enjoy not having answers, but because the absence of an answer here points somewhere that might be more interesting than any answer would be. So, which case stayed with you longest? Was it Karen, who went to the dentist and came home sounding like someone who had grown up in the British Isles? Was it the Croatian girl who woke from a coma speaking adult German nobody had taught her? Was it the man who remembered a harbour on the right side of a village he had never visited? Or was it FK, sitting quietly somewhere in England right now, with 3 notebooks full of a language the world does not know? Leave your answer in the comments. We genuinely want to know. And if you could travel to any time or wake up as any version of yourself, which one would you choose? Tell us that too. If you made it to the end of this one, you're exactly the kind of person who belongs here. Subscribe, and we will keep going deeper. The next video is on screen now, and trust us, it goes somewhere this one did not even touch.